A couple of questions for me, quickly. First, for Paul Marshall. If, as you argue, Islam is dominated by radicals, why aren't Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, or for that matter, hundreds, tens of millions of Muslims in India all knuckling under to jihadist movements and creating Islamic revolutions in those countries? Why haven't we seen more Islamic revolutions?
Because most Muslims don't like the radicals' agenda.
They're not dominated
Precisely.
by it.
Well, no, I think if people have guns, if they intimidate people, if they're organized, if they have funding, if one sees even in Indonesia the increase in radical movements, radical imams who were not there 10, 15, 20 years ago. When you see in Indonesia the destruction of hundreds of churches, where 10 years ago in Indonesia, 20 years ago, you would never have seen that. People coexisted. So even in places like Indonesia, in places like Bangladesh, in places like Malaysia, even though most of the people don't want it, you have the growth of radical movements, and they often win because they intimidate and scare other
Paul
people.
Marshall.
Okay,
Paul Marshall knows that those churches are primarily Chinese-owned, and the Chinese form a socioeconomic community in Indonesia that has been at great odds with the majority Muslim population there, and that a lot of those churches are not religious violence, it's ethnic, social violence. But more importantly, again, here we go, we're talking about this idea of
By the
domination.
way, most of the churches are non-ethnic Chinese.
The majority of Christians in Indonesia are Chinese, or Chinese of Chinese ethnicity.
And you know that Lashkar Jihad does not justify its attacks that way. It justified a general religious war against Christians.
But again, they
which
don't
was the
dominate.
primary group responsible for
But that's
that
the point,
violence.
is that they do not dominate either the discussion about Islam in Indonesia or the society of Indonesia or the government. We're talking, there's one country in the world.
I agree with you and Edina that they don't dominate the discussions, the conferences, when people get together.
Right.
But those don't have much effect.
No,
the people with guns beat the people with
Paul?
professors every time.
They
What do they
dominate
dominate?
actions. What I thought was really
Asra
interesting.
Nomani.
What I thought was really interesting was that, Edina, you even talked about the moderates re-emerging as the dominant force in the faith, an acknowledgement that they are not the dominant force.
They're
in the faith.
what they
re-emerging
dominate-
I'm not going to
since
thank you one
September
second.
11th.
No,
What they dominate-
I want to hear
precisely.
Edina. I want to hear Edina
I would like
answer
to
the
just-
question.
I would like to
from
just make
Asra
the point
Nomani.
that talk is great to point out. This is not a popularity contest of what Muslims mostly think. I mean, this is about our institutional faith, if you ask me. When we talk about whether Islam is dominated by radicals, domination to me is, do they have leadership in our communities, and are they taking action that is representative of a violent strain of Islam? And I'd say yes.
Asra Nomani, thanks, and Edina Lekovic. Well, let me ask you a specific question, by the way. You spoke of Saudi Arabia as a pocket that we shouldn't take as representative any more than murderers in America should be representative of American life. Wouldn't you concede that the role of Saudi Arabia, and Iran for that matter, on the global stage is far disproportionate to their mere numerical position in Islam? They have influence beyond their own borders.
Absolutely, but let's consider also where that comes from. Let's consider the kind of U.S. support that Saudi Arabia also gets in reciprocity.
Well,
now, in no way do I place any sort of validity or endorsement on the Saudi ideology. Is it out there? Are there Qur'ans out there that we find problems with? Absolutely. But even the Saudi people would disagree in large part with what their government is doing, and there is no foundation whatsoever for the kinds of distorted perceptions of faith that they're spreading on the ground. And that in no way represents the global reality of Islam. Again, looking at pockets and trying to turn them into global realities, we have to recognize and reinforce the majority. So that is, and that's precisely what has happened since 9/11, which is the point that I was trying to make. That's where the re-emergence is taking place.
David Gartenstein-Ross, you seem to cite as evidence of the fact that Muslims are dominated by radicals the desire to see restrictions in Europe on freedom of speech that included cartoons that Muslims deemed blasphemous. In Europe, in Britain for that matter, there are laws that restrict incitement to race hate, which we would find a violation of our First Amendment. Do you believe that laws that ban punishment of racist or anti-Semitic or anti-Islamist images or literature, that to support such laws is a mark of an extremist, or in the context of Europe, is it part of the way in which the law has developed there that has not created fascist societies in France, Italy, and Britain recently?
Well, you have to parse some of those laws. I mean, there's the racial incitement laws, which is one thing, and I don't have a problem with racial incitement laws. Then there's vilification laws. Vilification laws are adopted in some countries. France and Italy are examples. Most countries in Europe do not have it, including Britain. I do think, in terms of those, it's debatable as to why a country would have it and whether it's evidence of radicalism. But I think saying that every country in the world should adopt a certain law to limit speech in the case of religion is evidence of radicalism.
But if a religious movement pressed for universal laws that would ban degrading images or comments about their faith, would you take that as per se a mark of extremism on behalf of that faith?
Not per se a mark of extremism. I agree with that, but I think that contextually I would define it as such. And it looks like Paul has something he wants to
Paul Marshall, you have something to add.
Yeah. Depends what the government is. You have, through the Organization of the Islamic Conference, an effort going on since about 1999 to repress, through the international system, to repress speech it says is critical of Islam or blasphemous. Pakistan has been big on this. Iran has been big on this. The Saudis have been big on this. Remember, brief example I gave before is Saudi democracy activists are accused of blasphemy. In Iran, Akbar Ganji, the major dissident, was accused of insulting Islam. That domestically, these repressive regimes use charges of blasphemy to squelch the opposition. Basically, they say, we represent Islam, you criticize us, you criticize Islam, you're a blasphemer. When these regimes try to push this into the international sphere, I think it should be strongly opposed.
But when you have autocratic regimes that ban parties that use religion and so forth, you don't object to that. The Egyptians will not allow a religious party. The Turks, through the Constitutional Court, they're now trying to ban the governing party there. I mean,
I don't like that either.
A governing party, by the way, which calls itself Islamist and yet has brought 7 years of unprecedented economic growth, has brought Turkey closer to the United States and Israel than it's ever been before, has given more freedoms and rights to religious minorities and ethnic minorities than it has ever been before. But they want to say that it's okay if you're a woman and you want to go to college, you can put a scarf over your head. And because of that, they're seen as anti-democratic, as violating secularism, as, again, this awful word Islamist. It's not so easy to just kind of tag the Muslim Brotherhood or the AKP, as though the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, is one entity, according to something that was written in the 1930s, by Hassan al-Banna.
Well, I'll quote the current Guardian if you want.
We can quote them as we go on through the evening. We can quote all of the Muslim brethren before we're done.